I came home on a Tuesday and found her shoes by the door. Just the one pair, her good ones, the navy flats she wore to work. So she'd been home. But the house was quiet in that particular way it gets when no one's actually in it. The kind of quiet that has a weight to it. I called out. Nothing. Checked the kitchen, the bedroom, the back garden. Her handbag was gone. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I told myself she'd popped out with a friend. Forgot to text. It happens, or it used to, years ago, before we were the sort of couple who tracked each other's movements out of habit. I made a cup of tea and sat with it until it went cold. By 8 that night, I rang her mobile again. Voicemail. I rang her sister in Tauranga. She hadn't heard from her. I rang her work colleague, a woman named Janet, who she'd been friendly with for years. Janet said she'd left at 5:30, same as usual. Said she seemed completely normal. Had a laugh about something in the lift on the way out, Janet told me. Completely normal. I am 63 years old. I have lived in this house for 22 years. I have been married to my wife. I'll call her my wife throughout this because that is what she was, legally and in every other sense, until she wasn't for 19 of those years. I mention my age not to ask for sympathy, but because I want you to understand that by the time you're 63, you think you know how your life works. You think you know the shape of it. The rhythms. Who calls whom when something happens. What silence means, and what it doesn't. I did not sleep that night. I kept the lamp on her side of the bed switched on, which I haven't done since my mother was ill, and I used to keep a lamp on in case I needed to get up quickly. By 2 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with her photo up on my phone, a nice one from my nephew's wedding in Rotorua 3 years back, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. By Wednesday morning, I rang the police. I felt foolish doing it. The constable on the phone was patient in the way that people are patient when they think you might be a bit much. She's an adult, sir. Adults are allowed to go places without telling family. Is there any reason to believe she might be in danger? Any mental health history? Any domestic concerns? I said no to all of it. Which was true. As far as I knew, they took the report. Said they'd look into it. I went to work. I teach secondary school. Have done for 31 years. Year 11 and 12 history. And sat through 2 periods feeling like I was watching myself from across the room. At lunch, I rang her mobile again. Voicemail. Again. What you don't understand, if you haven't been through something like this, is how your brain works against you in the silence. It builds narratives. It offers you possibilities in a very calm, rational voice. One at a time. Like a prosecutor laying out exhibits. Maybe she had an accident. Maybe she's in hospital somewhere, and no one knows to contact you. Maybe she needed to get away for a bit and didn't know how to say so. Maybe something happened that she was too frightened to tell you about. Maybe you did something and you don't even know what it was. That last one is the one that lodges. You sit there at 63 and you start going back through everything, every argument, every quiet dinner, every time you went to bed without saying much, trying to find the thing you missed. She came back on Friday evening. I was in the living room. I heard the key in the lock, and I stood up so fast I knocked my reading glasses off the arm of the chair. She came in with her overnight bag, small one, the green canvas one she uses for weekend stays, and she looked tired. Not frightened, not distressed. Tired in the way you are after a long few days away from home. Like she'd been somewhere, and it had caught up with her. I said her name. I said, "Where have you been?" She set the bag down. She said, and I want to be exact about this because I have turned it over in my mind so many times since. I needed some time to think. I don't owe you an explanation for every movement I make. I am not a man who shouts. In 31 years of teaching teenagers, I have raised my voice perhaps 4 times, and only ever because a situation required it. So I did not shout. I said, very quietly, The police are looking for you. Your sister has been ringing me twice a day. I haven't slept since Tuesday." She looked at me for a moment, not with guilt, I have to say, but with something more like irritation, which I found almost more disturbing than anything else she might have shown me. And then she said she was exhausted and she was going to have a bath. I stood in the living room and listened to the water run. There is a particular feeling that I don't have a good word for. It's not anger exactly, and it's not grief, and it's not shock, though it has elements of all three. It's more like the moment when a piece of furniture you've been leaning against for years suddenly isn't there anymore, and you feel the lurch in your body before your brain has caught up with what's happened. That is what I felt standing there listening to the bathwater. She came out later, in her dressing gown, and made herself toast. I sat across from her at the kitchen table. I said, "I need you to tell me where you were." She said she'd been in Wellington. With a friend. She said it was nothing I needed to worry about, and she'd appreciate it if I could give her some space to process things. Wellington. We live in Hamilton. It's not a short trip, I said. Which friend? She said I wouldn't know them. I said, I've been married to you for 19 years. I would like to know which friend my wife drove 4 hours to stay with in Wellington for 3 days without telling me. She said, I went there to think. That's all I'm going to say about it. That was Friday night. On Saturday morning, I rang my younger brother, who lives in Christchurch. He's been through his own marriage ending messy, years ago, 2 children involved, and I thought if anyone would know what to make of this, it might be him. He listened without saying much. Then he said, Mate, you need to find out who she was actually with. I said I didn't know how to do that without following her around like I didn't trust her. He said, It sounds like maybe you shouldn't trust her. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. The thing about 19 years is that you have a lot of reasons not to believe the bad possibility. You have birthday cards and holidays and inside jokes and shared grief. Her mother died 4 years ago and I held her while she cried and I meant it. Every second of it. You have a house you renovated together, and a garden you planted together, and a life that is so woven through with another person that pulling on one thread seems like it might unravel everything. So you don't pull the thread. You wait. You tell yourself there's an explanation. You sleep badly, and you say very little, and you wait. She spent the weekend in the garden mostly, barely spoke to me. On Sunday afternoon I said, very calmly, that I needed her to call the police and let them know she was home and safe. She looked startled. I think she had genuinely not considered that I might have involved them, and then she went quiet and said she'd do it. She did ring them. I found out later. Said she'd gone away for personal reasons and apologized for the concern. Monday morning I watched her leave for work, and then I sat at the kitchen table and made a decision. I am not proud of every step I took, but I want to be honest about it, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I went to a private investigator. I found him through a colleague who'd used his firm during a complicated dispute involving a business partner, nothing salacious, just someone they needed information on. He was a quiet, careful man. Ran a small operation with 2 other investigators. I sat in his office and felt ridiculous, like a character in a genre I had never expected to find myself in. He didn't make me feel ridiculous. He just took notes and asked practical questions. He said, How long do you want us to look? I said, As long as it takes to know. The report came back in 9 days. She had not been alone in Wellington. She had stayed 3 nights at a hotel in Tiaro. A reasonably nice one, not lavish but not cheap, in a room booked under someone else's name. The other name belonged to a man, 51 years old, who worked in commercial property. The photos were clear. The report was thorough. It included entry and exit times, restaurant receipts, a photograph taken outside the hotel on the 2nd evening that I cannot describe in much detail because even now it is difficult to think about. I did not react the way I thought I would. I had imagined, in the abstract, that if something like this ever happened, I would be furious, incandescent. I was not. I was very still. I read the report twice. I put it in a manila folder. I rang a lawyer, a woman who had been recommended to me by a friend years ago for her work in property, and who also, it turned out, handled family law. I made an appointment for Thursday. On Wednesday evening, I made dinner as normal. Pasta. She came home from work and sat across from me and talked about a meeting she'd had with a difficult parent and asked me how my day was. I answered her questions. I have thought about that dinner many times. I don't know what it says about either of us that we sat there and spoke about ordinary things while I had a manila folder in my study that would end our marriage. The lawyer was excellent. She went through everything methodically. She told me what I was entitled to, what the likely timeline was, what the process would look like. She told me that New Zealand's no-fault divorce framework meant the specifics of the affair were not directly relevant to the division of property, but that they were relevant to my understanding of what I wanted. She was right about that. I came home on Thursday evening and asked my wife to sit down. I put the manila folder on the table. I said, "I know where you were. I know who you were with. I have seen the photographs." She looked at the folder. She did not open it. Her face did something complicated. I saw guilt and calculation moving across it in quick succession. And then she seemed to settle on something, and she said, "It's not what you think." I said, "I've had a professional investigator working for 9 days. I think it's exactly what I think." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We can talk about this. We can work through it. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly." I said, "You had 3 days to not think clearly. You had 3 days, and then you came home, and you told me you didn't owe me an explanation. So here is mine. I'm filing for divorce." She said, "You're going to throw away 19 years over this?" I said, "You threw them away. I'm just tidying up after you." That is not a line I had prepared. It came out, and I meant it, and I do not regret saying it, though I have wondered since whether it was kind. I don't think kindness was what was called for at that particular moment. What followed was not clean or quick, because these things never are. She cried. She asked if we could try counseling. She rang her sister, who rang me twice, actually, over the following 2 days, and said that my wife was devastated and that she hoped I would take time to consider whether I was being hasty. I was civil to her sister. I said I had considered it, and I was not being hasty. Her friend, the Wellington friend, the man from commercial property I never met. I didn't want to. The investigator told me he was married with 2 children. I have thought about that a great deal. I hope his wife knows, though I have no way of knowing whether she does. That is not my situation to manage. The difficult part came about 3 weeks later. She had moved out by then, gone to stay with her sister in Tauranga temporarily, and I was beginning to get used to the particular quality of a house that has only one person in it again. The lamp on her side of the bed was off. That was something. Anyway, her father rang me. He is a man in his late 70s, a retired engineer, Wellington-based, always been polite to me, sent a card every birthday. He said he wanted to meet. I said I thought that was probably not a good idea under the circumstances. He said he was asking as a father, not as an adversary. I agreed to coffee. He arrived at my house on a Saturday morning and sat in the kitchen chair where she used to sit and said that his daughter had made a terrible error in judgment and was deeply sorry. He said he hoped I could find it in myself to understand that people sometimes did things they couldn't explain. That fear and confusion made people do things that didn't reflect who they really were. He said he believed his daughter loved me. I listened to all of this. I said, "I understand that she's your daughter, and you're trying to do the right thing by her. But I want to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer. If your wife had done this, had disappeared for 3 days, Come home. Told you she didn't owe you an explanation, and then you found photographs. Would you have wanted your father-in-law to come and tell you to understand her better? He was quiet for a long time. He said, "No, I suppose not." He left shortly after. I respect him for having the honesty to say that. The divorce took approximately 5 months. Not as fast as these things sometimes go, but not drawn out either. The lawyer was efficient and clear-eyed. There were practical complications around the house. We'd both contributed to the mortgage, though I'd contributed more initially and some superannuation to work through. None of it was pleasant. None of it needed to be. I got the house. She got the car, and a sum that reflected the years she'd put in. The settlement was, by all accounts, fair. My lawyer told me she'd expected the other side to be more contentious. I think my ex-wife, understood somewhere in herself that she didn't have a great deal of ground to stand on. The last time I saw her was to sign documents. She looked like someone who had been through a difficult time, which she had. I felt something when I looked at her, not love anymore, but something in the vicinity of sorrow for what had been true once and wasn't now. I think that's probably the most honest thing I can say about it. I am still teaching, still in the same house. Though I have rearranged some things and the garden is different now, I've let the bit she planted along the back fence go its own way, and I've put in vegetable beds instead, which I'm finding unexpectedly absorbing. My brother came up for a weekend in winter, and we cleared out the back shed, and he was good company. My nephew from Rotorua comes for dinner occasionally and brings his wife, who is warm and funny and thinks I need to eat more, which is probably true. I am 63 years old, and I am starting to understand something about this stage of life. You think, by the time you're here, that the large, unexpected things are mostly behind you, that the map of your life is mostly drawn. You are wrong about this, but it takes something like what happened to me to show you clearly that you're wrong. There is a version of this story in which I am a victim and she is a villain and everything is simple. I do not entirely believe in that version, though I understand why people prefer it. 19 years is long enough for the truth to be complicated. Long enough for both people to have failed each other in small ways that accumulate. Long enough for distance to grow without either of you noticing it happen. I am not saying that excuses what she did. I don't believe it does. I am saying that the simple version leaves out the texture of a life, and the texture is the part that actually matters. What I do believe, and I believe it more now than I did when I was younger, and thought I understood people, is that honesty, even when it's brutal, is always worth more than the kindness of pretending. She was not honest with me. She had not been honest with me for some time before those 3 days in Wellington, I think. Though I cannot know exactly how long. That dishonesty cost us both more than it needed to. Honesty, even the hard kind, gives the other person the chance to respond to what is real. Dishonesty takes that chance away. It is a kind of theft. I also believe this. You can survive the loss of something you thought you could not survive, losing. The first few weeks, I genuinely was not sure. The house was very quiet, and my sleep was poor. And there were moments, usually early in the morning, that gray hour before the light comes properly, when the loss of it, the loss of what I had thought my life would look like, sat on my chest, like something physical. But those moments passed. They pass more quickly than you expect them to. I am not happy in the way I was happy before, but I am not unhappy in the way I was afraid I would be. I am something in between, something that does not have a tidy name. Most days, that feels like enough. Some days it feels like quite a lot. If you are watching this, and you are in something that does not feel right, where the silences are too long or the answers are too thin, or you have started explaining away things you would not explain away for anyone else. Not here to tell you what to do. I am 63, and I have been wrong about a great many things. But I will say this. You already know. The part of you that sent you here, to this kind of story, already knows. What you do with that knowledge is yours to decide. But the knowing is not the problem. The knowing is actually where the ground is. Take care of yourself. That is not a small thing. It may be the most important thing. I have thought about the shape of what happened, not obsessively, not the way I did in those first raw weeks, but quietly, the way you think about something when the urgency has gone out of it. And what's left is just the plain fact of it sitting there to be looked at clearly. What I keep coming back to is this. The choices she made did not happen in an instant. They accumulated. Small decisions, one after another, each one a little further from honesty, until the distance became so large that she couldn't find her way back to it without tearing something open. And so she didn't. She kept going, and the further she went, the more the consequences grew. Not because the universe was punishing her, not because of anything mystical, but simply because that is what happens when you build a life on a foundation that isn't true. Eventually, the weight of it shows. I am not a man who believes in fate. I am a history teacher. I believe in cause and effect. I believe that what we do, the actual daily choices we make, not the grand gestures but the small quiet ones, is what shapes what comes back to us. She chose to deceive. She chose, when she came home, to double down on that deception rather than face it. She chose the words, "I don't owe you an explanation," when what she might have chosen, at great cost to herself and great courage, was the truth. Each of those choices narrowed what was possible next. By the time she was sitting across from the manila folder, there was almost nothing left to choose. I think about that when I am tempted, as any person is, at 63, with time to reflect, to wonder whether I could have done something differently. And maybe I could have. Maybe there were years in there when I was less present than I should have been, when I let the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage substitute for actually paying attention. I hold that, honestly. But I also know that the choices at the end were hers. Made fully, with enough time to reconsider each one. What I have tried to carry forward from all of it is something about integrity, not the word as it gets used in speeches, but the thing itself. The practice of it, being the same person whether or not anyone is watching, saying what you mean when it costs something to say it. Not building structures out of half-truths because they feel easier in the moment. I did not always manage that perfectly during those 19 years, but I tried, and I try still. It matters. Not because it makes life simpler, it often doesn't, but because it makes the ground under your feet real. You know where you stand. That is worth more than I understood when I was younger. The other thing, and I say this as someone who genuinely did not know if he'd come out the other side of it intact, is that resilience is not something you have or don't have. It is something you find out about by going through things. I did not know I could rebuild the ordinary texture of a day on my own again. And then, slowly, I could. The garden helped. My brother helped. Showing up to school on Monday mornings helped, which surprised me. Life has a way of insisting on itself, and that insistence, annoying as it can feel at the time, is actually a kind of gift. Take care of the truth. Take care of yourself. And if the ground shifts under you when it shifts, because it will trust that you are more capable of standing on new ground than you think.